good morning and a good afternoon for those that are in Washington or those that are in Europe and Ukraine. I wanted to just welcome everybody, especially to Tetiana, Oleksandr, and Eugene, who are our speakers today, but also to those that are joining us. And we'll have a video of today's conversation that we'll be sharing widely, but we wanted to thank our speakers for joining us. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund. I'm also the co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine that we co-chair with colleagues in Kiev. My colleague Orest, who's on the screen as well, who will just do a short intro in a moment. And also I want to welcome Olena Prokopenko, who is my GMF colleague, but also co-chair of TTFU as well in Ukraine. TTFU, as I mentioned, partners with a number of different organizations, GMF, Black Sea Trust, RPR is a partner as well, lead partner on this. And I wanted to thank them as well for helping us put together today's conversation. Of course, we're focused today, the title of the event is focused on holding Russia and Russian military, Mr. Putin, accountable for war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. And the title of the event is also Standing with Ukraine. And we understand that on one hand, we are looking at what is taking place. On one hand, what do we need to provide and support, how best to support Ukrainians at this moment? And then also on the other hand, how to make certain that you hold those accountable for war crimes that are taking place, including some in the international community who don't see what's happening in the same light. And so today we brought together three experts, leading voices, Ukrainian voices, to speak to this issue, but also to talk about what is needed to support them and colleagues in Ukraine to ensure that there's a full documentation and understanding of what's taking place. And as we all heard, President Biden just recently called what is taking place a genocide. You have other international leaders standing up and speaking to this issue as well. That alone is incredibly important to call it for what it is. And then also, once we understand exactly what it is to prevent more atrocities from happening. And so speeding up support, military assistance, including that which we saw President Biden announce yesterday, was really important. So if I missed any of our partners, I apologize. We only have a short time where we have these three experts with us today. Orest, if I can just send it over to you, and then we'll send it over to Olena to just quickly introduce our speakers and kick off today's conversation. So Orest, over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks to John Alexander, who helps put these events together on our US end, and to, of course, our invaluable RPR partners for organizing this event. And let me especially thank our speakers and really commend them for all the important work they've been doing during these perilous times, and actually for their work over many years to defend human rights and civil liberties. Our speakers will discuss the atrocities and war crimes taking place today and what's being done to document and investigate those. And there is a lot of incredible work, I think, taking place. But let me use this opportunity to provide a brief historical context. Russia's denigration of Ukraine is nothing new. For more than 300 years, the Ukrainians, and that's been the majority of them who've had the misfortune of living under Russian domination, have always had their rights and freedoms, individual as well as national, denied to them. And for most of that time, Moscow's had a program to Russify Ukraine, in a sense to, and I quote President Biden, to wipe out the idea of even being able to be Ukrainian, as he put it so succinctly and so well the other day when he called what was happening in Ukraine a genocide. Under the Russian Empire, back under the Tsars, there were no individual freedoms to speak of. Ukrainian identity was stifled, including, for example, even banning the publishing of Ukrainian language books. There was even an imperial decree back in 1863 that stated that the Ukrainian language never existed, does not exist, and will not exist. And during Soviet rule, and let's face it, I think the Soviet Union was just another manifestation, despite its claims of internationalism, an especially evil manifestation of Russian imperialism, of the Russian Empire. Millions lost their lives in the Holodomor, the genocidal famine of 32-33, or in Stalinist purges or executions of much of Ukraine's intelligentsia. Millions more were imprisoned and exiled to Siberia. And churches linked with Ukrainian identities, such as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox churches, were brutally suppressed and banned. And in the 70s and 80s, individual dissidents, including Ukrainian Helsinki monitors, were sent to the Gulag. Why? For peacefully calling upon the Soviet government to live up to its freely undertaken international human rights commitments, or for daring to criticize Moscow's policies of Russification. And of course, since Russia's 2014 invasion, we've seen egregious human rights abuses and the stifling Ukrainian identity in Crimea, and especially against the Crimean Tatars as well, and in the Donbass. You know, I think in the last decade, nowhere in Europe and in few places around the world has the human rights situation been more appalling than in these occupied territories. Until now, that is. In the last few weeks, you know, the whole world has witnessed the really grotesque manifestations of what I consider to be Putin's pathological obsession with Ukraine and his desire to liquidate Ukrainian statehood and eliminate the Ukrainian nation as such. And that's why Ukraine has no choice but to keep fighting, and we in the West need to continue to help the Ukrainian people in every way possible, and that includes even more weapons and more sanctions. Jonathan mentioned the additional $800 million in military assistance announced yesterday. This help is badly needed to help Ukraine defeat the perverse Russian imperialist ideology that denies Ukrainians not only their dignity as human beings and their right to choose their own national identity and national future. It's an ideology, if you will, that's killing innocent people before our very eyes. So, you know, I think to conclude, the only real antidote to Putin's goal to, again, to use the words of Joe Biden, to wipe out the idea of even being able to be Ukrainian, is an independent, democratic Ukraine free from Moscow's domination. With that, I look forward to hearing from our speakers. And Olena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Horace. Thank you, Jonathan. Dear colleagues, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are now in day 50 of Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine. This appalling invasion has already brought about the largest scale destruction since World War II, wiping out Ukrainian cities and towns, killing hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers at the very least, and thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including at least 186 children. Russian forces are obviously struggling to prevail against the Ukrainian army and are taking the revenge on civilians. They are using prohibited weapons to bomb maternity hospitals and kindergartens, museums and churches, orphanages and nursing homes. They burn people alive. They rape women and children. They shoot dead, peaceful columns of civilians who are trying to evacuate from their bombing or burning towns. And Russian forces are abducting city mayors and forcefully deporting thousands of people who are kidnapped from bomb shelters to economically depressed regions of Russia, reviving the Nazi practice of filtration camps. At least 15,000 Ukrainians have been reportedly abducted from Mariupol alone. Every fourth Ukrainian has had to leave their home, not knowing if they will be able to ever come back. If the war continues, many of them will unfortunately have to build a new life abroad. According to the latest polls, 44% of Ukrainians are currently separated from their families due to the war. Ukrainian women and children continue fleeing the country, while men aged 18-60 have remained in Ukraine as they're liable for conscription. And the ways this forced separation will affect the very fabric of the Ukrainian society long-term remains uncertain. And today we have invited 3 distinguished Ukrainian experts to shed the light for us on how Russia can actually be held accountable for the genocide and despicable destructions that it is committing in Ukraine, and how the newly discovered crimes, war crimes, can urge the West to enhance its defense assistance to Ukraine and to strengthen sanctions against Russia. And today we're joined by Tetiana Pechonchyk, head of the board of Human Rights Center ZMINA, Oleksandr Pavlichenko, director of the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, and Eugene Krapyvin, expert on criminal justice at the Center for Political and Legal Reforms. And I would like to address my first question to Tetiana Pechonchyk. Over the past 2 weeks, since the world has seen unthinkable atrocities committed by Russia in Kiev suburbs of Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, let alone besieged Mariupol, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, we're hearing increasingly often that deliberate mass murders of civilians in Ukraine is being referred as genocide, including by President Biden. Moreover, experts in international humanitarian law argue that not only the murders, but also sex crimes have the nature that implies a genocidal intent. Could you please clarify for us what makes Russia's massacre
Tetiana, I think Olena froze, but I think you know oh, Olena, you're back. You froze for 2 seconds.
Oh.
You're about to complete your last sentence.
Yeah, I was asking Tetiana to explain, to clarify for us what makes Russia's massacre in Ukraine a clear-cut genocide, and what international mechanisms can Ukraine employ, if any, to stop it as soon as possible.
Olena, thank you for inviting me to this panel to speak. I'm Tetiana Pechonchyk, the head of the Human Rights Center ZMINA, and our NGO has been documenting human rights abuses in the occupied Crimea since the beginning of 2014, when Russia took control over the Crimean Peninsula. And we see this large-scale war that erupted in Ukraine as continuation of impunity of the Russian Federation for all crimes they committed, not only in Crimea and Donbass, but also Georgia, Syria, and other conflicts where Russia was involved. And this impunity and those lack of accountability actually led to this large-scale attack, alongside with the policies of Western countries that were were looking on the Russian Federation with their closed eyes, where trading oil and gas and supplying to Russian Federation military equipment all these years, while we were calling to impose strict economic sanctions for what Russia did in Crimea and Donbass. Unfortunately, those sanctions that were imposed were rather artificial, and they didn't hit Russian regime, and Russian regime was only growing all these years. So now it's high time to stop Putinist Russia, to stop its regime, to prevent the next disasters that might happen not only to our country but also to others. Olena, you put your question about genocide, and I do agree with this assessment that there is no doubt that crimes which are committed on a large scale by Russian army in Ukraine can be definitely qualified as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is not only some occasional crimes, this is a deliberate tactics of the Russian Federation, their method of warfare, when the Russian army not hits only Ukrainian army, but also hits civilian population with all possible means. And this is happening. One of the reasons is that their initial plan to conquer Ukraine just within a few days failed, and Ukrainians were not greeting Russian army here with flowers. So now we also can speak about the signs of genocide when we describe all these crimes which are being committed in Ukraine. My NGO, Human Rights Center ZMINA, is one of the 26 organizations that formed the coalition of NGO documenting war crimes in Ukraine. This is Ukraine 5 AM coalition. This is a time when we all woke up from the sounds of explosions in different cities of Ukraine. I woke up in the morning in my apartment in Kiev, and on the next day of this war, we already started collection of the data, working from bomb shelters, from the platform of metro stations, from different, trying also to escape from the most dangerous places. But it is important that this work was continuing all the time, and we formed a network of monitors who collect all this data. 2 weeks ago, actually on 3rd of April, Ukraine 5 AM coalition published its statement on Bucha events, where we, among other atrocities, also drew our attention and called the UN Commission of Inquiry and ICC also to investigate the possible presence of signs of genocide in what Russia is committing in Ukraine. Why this can be, why we think it has a signs of genocide? First, and why this crime can be potentially qualified alongside with war crimes and crimes against humanity. First, one have to look at the Russian policy in the occupied Crimea and Donbass throughout all these years, which was directed to destroy Ukrainian identity in all possible ways. And working in Crimea, we documented many examples of it, the disappearance of Ukrainian language from the education, attacks on those people who, for example, had some Ukrainian flags, or we also did a documentation, monitoring of the informational space in Crimea with a huge wave of hate speech, and among all the examples of hate speech in Crimean informational space, 3/3 of all examples were against Ukrainians. Second, is a famous speech of Russian President Vladimir Putin on 21st of February, where he basically denied existence of Ukrainian nation. It was 3 days before the large-scale attack on Ukraine, and where he basically denied also Ukraine as a state, and also referring to Soviet people, etc., etc. And also one have to remember these years and years of propaganda, very heavy propaganda against Ukrainians, hate speech on the state-funded Russian media and television, and with filled also with propaganda of war. So if we all this combine together with all these atrocities that we see and that we fix every day from Russian soldiers, we can also definitely speak about the signs of genocide. And one more also proof is a deportation of Ukrainians from these newly occupied territories by Russia to the territory of occupied Crimea and so-called DPR and LPR, and then to the territory of the Russian Federation. We already see that Russian authorities have this deliberate policy on, for example, integration of Ukrainian children in the Russian educational space. They already declared that they will reteach them in Russian language to erase all signs of Ukrainian identity. But this is not only attack on Ukrainians and Ukrainian identity, but also against some groups. For example, my NGO, ZMINA, is documenting enforced disappearances of active citizens of local communities on the territories newly taken by the Russian Federation. And now we've documented over 130 cases of abductions of city mayors, local politicians, village heads, local journalists, volunteers, activists, those outstanding people And doing this, Russia wants to achieve two purposes at least. First is to break the resistance from local population, because we saw numerous examples when people got to protest with Ukrainian flags under the gun of Russian troops in these newly occupied cities and villages. And the second is to make those local the representatives of local self-government to collaborate with occupying power, which in the majority of cases did not happen. And unfortunately, we fix that alongside with this practice of abductions, there are numerous cases of applying torture and even extrajudicial killings. That's why we also would like to call all of you to inform more about these cases of enforced disappearances, because this would help, if not to release these people, but at least to minimize the risk of application of torture against them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tetiana. And just a very quick question, and possible, if possible, a quick answer. What do you think Ukraine can do to prove that this is a genocide on the international level? What are the international mechanisms we can use to ensure justice?
Well, there is the International Criminal Court that has, despite Ukraine didn't ratify Rome Statute, the ICC has jurisdiction over Ukraine, and ICC investigates three types of crimes. It's war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crime of genocide. And we also call to the ICC and to the UN Commission of Inquiry to look into the possibility of these crimes together with very obvious for everyone now large practice of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And one more thing is the crime of aggression, which doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of the existing international courts, and it's not applicable specifically on the situation in Ukraine. And we call for the creation of the special tribunal that will also regard the crimes of aggression, because due to this crime of Russian military aggression of war, all other crimes now are happening on a very large scale.
Thanks so much again, Tetiana, for this comprehensive analysis. It was really very enlightening for all of us, I believe. And now I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, to Oleksandr Pavlichenko. Oleksandr, you recently said, quote, Vladimir Putin and his henchmen believe that they are above the law, that they can get away with the bloodshed because the world needs their gas and oil, unquote. Do you feel that this is still the case? Has the international pressure put on Russia and Putin personally changed this perception at all? Also, we see significant efforts on the national and international levels aimed at collecting and registering Russia's war crimes in Ukraine. Do you see these efforts as well coordinated? How can international communities support Ukraine in collecting this evidence? And how can it help accelerate the process of ensuring justice? Oleksandr, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me and Tetiana to this. Sorry, now we have exactly the air attack. Sorry, you just heard our conditions, how we are living. It's the third time for the day. Still. Thanks for inviting us to this very important platform to discuss crucial issue on Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and answering your first question about the possibility to bring to justice Putin and the high military officials of Russia and politicians, media persons. The issue is in functional immunity, so-called, that is provided to the high-rank officials and allow them to not to be prosecuted even when they are considered at the criminals of high level committed crimes, war crimes, genocide, and genocide or crimes of aggression. Here we see the problem. Second problem is in the not perfect construction of international system, and we are aware that even now we see in the meetings of the United Nations institutions like Security Council, the role and the position of the Russia representative that proclaims its vision of the situation and even attempt to persuade the community in their positive attitude or role. It's also the obstacle when we are considering the possibility to bring the Russia and Russian representatives of the level of Putin or other high officials to justice when the permission or at least lack of veto from the National Security Council will be needed. And here I see we need to use also the legal instruments and the legal ways. For example, it might be the special procedure under the International Court of Justice with the elaborating and getting a legal opinion on such a situation and the possible conclusion and resolution of such situation. So it might be the proposal to international community and the result of the situation that now is in Ukraine with impossibility to overcome the functional immunity of high officials. So it's the one step. Second step is the recognition who is who and the proper reaction from the international society with the elimination of all possible contacts and functioning or functional roles of Russian officials on all levels. So it will diminish the, let's say, importance of the power or mandate on all levels, like, for example, in international representation on different level of Russia representatives. And here I see the also possible, not very fast, but still the way of development of such an prosecution, let's say, of Russia officials on international arena. As to the accountability and possibility to collect all the evidences of the war crime, of the other heavy crimes like aggression, or even if we consider such a possibility to recognize the genocide crimes. So here we may say that we have the organized work on national level with the public officials, with the law enforcement structures like Office of the Prosecutor General, Ministry of Interior, secret services, and plus it's like synergy, the strong support by the NGO society that realized its experience since 2014, since the beginning of the war, with the collection of such facts and presentation or creation of cases that might be brought to the national and international justice, like ICC, European Court of Human Rights, as it was in previous years. And very important, have the synergy and cooperation between all the actors that are in this field and are busy with the this work, especially in the field. I may tell that the resources needed are very, very, let's say, enormous, even enormous, to collect, to keep this information and to register, not only simple to register, but to investigate on the national level all such facts that are considered not only the, let's say, routine criminal acts, but the acts of the war crimes with special procedure for let's say, investigated and to prosecute accordingly to the international standards. And here, very important is, since the beginning of this process, inclusion of international experts dealing with the IHL standards, and probably even at that stage, we should be persuaded what kind of system, or should it be judiciary in ICC context, or special tribunal for Russia will be created with the mandate, with the peculiarity of its institution, and how it will be organized, with what results it should influence on the procedure of the organized work on national level. And last, we have not forget that the result of justice will depend on the result of the war. So we should be, we have to be persuaded in, and we trust into the victory of Ukrainians as the let's say, fighters for their freedom, for their values, and for their country. And for sure, Ukraine fight with the, let's say, one last sentence. Ukraine fight accordingly to the rules of war, let's say, keeping in mind that the attitude towards prisoners of war should be according to the international standards. But Russia doesn't recognize any rules. And I may bring you dozens or hundreds examples how, for example, Russia deals with civilians, with the prisoners of the war, and even the last sign, for example, the corpse of the killed soldiers that were lost on the street of Ukrainian villages and city without even possibility or without that they were burnt or brought to the let's say tombs or So
Great.
it was one concrete example how the Russian deals with the corpse, with the dead soldiers, but what they do with the live persons, it's other story. And finishing, I may draw your attention that we have to think on the person that suffered right now in imprisonment in the detention places in Russia. The number of POWs are among 1,700-800 persons. It's not proclaimed officially, but the number is relatively high. And some of them suffer from torture, some of them are killed even, and it's also this side of the story. The persons on occupied territories, they are victims and possible victims of new Bucha, and we have to think how to avoid the new Bucha in today's circumstances. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. You touched upon a very important point earlier in your presentation about the deficiencies and inadequacy of international human rights fora and security fora, because we can see that with the existing fora, a single war criminal in charge of a nuclear state can terrorize a 43 million nation without facing significant consequences for him personally. And if we want any justice to be served, of course, these fora have to be reformed very significantly. I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, to Yevhen. Paraphrasing what Oleksandr just said, it is quite evident that the magnitude of Russia's genocide and war crimes in Ukraine will largely depend on the strength of Ukraine's military response to Russia. So I'd like to, for a moment, shift this conversation from the human rights angle to the military dimension, and to ask you about today's capacities of the Ukrainian armed forces and territorial defense. What is their edge? What is their most pressing needs or needs for support, including from the international community? We can see in a number of foreign media that there's a clear narrative that Ukraine is about to fall if it doesn't receive significant defense assistance already now. How strong are we actually right now to keep standing?
Yeah, thank you, Olena, for the question. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm grateful to speak from Ukraine about the Ukrainian war, unfortunately, because now we have heavy times for the country, for all the citizens. So talking about military situation, of course, I'm not a military expert, I'm a legal expert, and I will talk about legal issues after the answer to this question. But as I see, we're all surprised, and especially the West countries are surprised how Ukraine stands in this war and how we're capable to defend ourselves from such huge country with nuclear weapons and so on. And now, after the 1.5 months of military defense, we see that our protection, our defense strategy is lead us to the win on the war, on the position of war. But the next step is to free the occupied lands. I mean Kherson, I mean South region, I mean Eastern region, and for this reason we need an offensive weapon, a heavy offensive weapon. And now this question is discussing in parliaments all over the world, and now we see for 1 week maybe a huge progress to understanding that Ukraine needs tanks, Ukrainian needs aviation, Ukrainian needs missiles, and because territorial defense, sorry, because territorial defense, Ukrainian army forces, they have more weapons for protection, and it is not enough. So from my point of view, of course, it will on this issue will depend how this war will end. And the next topic, depending on what is the result of the ending of the war, we'll see different scenarios in which which international justice can work, and we can bring to responsibility the Putin, his cronies, the Russian propagandists, I mean media workers, like in the case of International Tribunal for Rwanda, as we all know, propagandists, media workers, they also can be brought to responsibility. I mean the case of the radio of Thousands of Hills. Well, and I am, again, as a lawyer, I am mostly working with Ukrainian prosecutor's office, with prosecutors, with the question of qualification of war crimes, with the question of how to build data and evidences for the indictment for the further international procedure. And it is not just an international criminal court, it's also other institutions like ICJ, International Court of Justice, because we still have proceedings here, and it is universal jurisdiction because we have partners in several European countries which are going to help us, to support us to collect evidences, and then under universal jurisdiction, under national legislation, trying to bring for responsibility Putin and his cronies. And Ukraine, as you know, now notices of suspicion a lot of Russian high-level functionaries and propagandists, and ask Interpol to arrest them because the Red Notice, it's an universal document, universal provision that works for mostly civilized country, and of course, especially of Russia, they do not treat the Interpol Red Notices. Well, and for understanding what discussion now, we mentioned the genocide. Genocide is a hard question because on political level, I agree that these atrocities cannot be called war crimes or even crimes against humanity. It is genocide, but under the international law, it's much harder, and Ukrainian may be the first, really the first who called the genocide in the first days of war. We appealed to ICJ, International Court of Justice, and there was asking for provisional measures, and there was this formula that Russia planning to do genocide, so it is intent to genocide. And as we know, the difference between genocide and crimes against humanity, mass war crimes, it is intent to destroy four protected groups, either national, racial, religion, or ethnic. And in Ukrainian case, I agree that Russia, with this words of denazification, de-Ukrainization, and so on, they trying to destroy Ukrainian as a nation. So they do not agree that Ukrainian exists. They do not agree that to be a patriot, a Ukrainian patriot, it's be not a Nazi. Yes, for them, or all who supports Ukraine now in Ukraine, who want to speak on their own language and so on, for all of them, for Russians are now Nazis. And again, I think that it is a real dollar specialist, so it's a real intent to destroy Ukrainian as a national group. And I hope that these words will be not just an emotion or a political speech, it will be a certain legal qualification in International Criminal Court or and in universal jurisdiction. And also we mentioned tribunal, special tribunal, we call it Kharkiv Tribunal, but for now it could be also Mariupol Tribunal, Bucha Tribunal, or any other towns and cities which are perpetrated from suffering from Russian aggression. And what is the problem with this tribunal? Because as I see in publications of top top specialists in international law, in international criminal law, they all mostly skeptical on this idea because of immunities that have Russia and it has, and we understand that to compare with International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, it is opposite situation, because of course we cannot occupy Russia, we cannot divide it, we cannot physically catch the Putin and his cronies. But as Tetiana mentioned, we have this situation when aggression is a crime which is not under the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court for Ukraine, because we are not ratifying a Rome Statute, and also because even if we ratify it now, it should be 1 year post the ratification to use this definition, this crime, and Russia will never ratify this the statute, and UN security unfortunately cannot agree with the jurisdiction to Russia, because again right to veto. So this talks about tribunal mostly in the meaning of crime of aggression, because crime of aggression again it's one of the 4 heavy international crimes, and Russia also should be brought to responsibility on this crime. And for this reason, tribunal will exist, and now it is a question of the design of how it will look like. So my conclusion is that Ukraine now are working on all legal ways, or all different legal frontiers to bring Russia to responsibility. It's not only International Criminal Court, and because mostly of this mechanism are media talking, but it's also an universal jurisdiction. We're trying to bring them for responsibility by our own national legislation, by national legislation of European countries, and it will be special tribunal despite of the immunities, despite the results of the war. Will it be total win, or maybe some peaceful agreement with some consensus and so on? I think that the decision of these tribunals are important to the further isolation of Russia, to the further sanctions, economic sanctions to Russia, and to explain for years, for 10 years, tens of years, explain all over the world that Russia will be responsible for aggression, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, and of course for genocide, because that we'll see in Bucha, it is really intention to destroy Ukrainians as such. And if the Russian army will have the possibility to occupy not Bucha or south of Ukraine, but all the Ukraine, I think that it will be the same situation, because again, Putin and his cronies, they do not agree that Ukrainians has right to exist. And I think that this is the main problem, is to understand that all over the world, but not just in Ukraine, when we all definitely know that it is so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evgen. And we are now ready to turn it over to the audience and to open the floor for the questions that we received. And I'd like to read one of them that's addressed to all speakers. It's from Vasil Babich. Vasil's question is the following. What further sanctions, economical, political, other sanctions, should be adopted by the US, the EU, G7 countries to prevent further acts of genocide, war crimes of Russia in Ukraine? What sanctions could be most effective in the situation we're in? Yeah, whoever would like to take this question can go first. Maybe Tetiana, would you like to address this question regarding the sanctions that would be most adequate right now? And we can see how some of these sanctions that are imposed are strong compared to the previous ones we saw in 2014 and later, but still apparently not strong enough to ward off the Russian aggression. Yeah, Tetiana, I can see your hands.
Yes, I'm afraid there is no sanctions that could stop the war immediately, but the most important sanctions that would stop war as soon as possible is a full oil and gas embargo. It is something that many countries are very reluctant to do. And also on a technical side, I think it's very important to switch off from SWIFT all Russian and Belarusian banks to make all operations not possible, to paralyze their financial system, to stop all trading with Russia, to stop all Russian ships entering the navy ports, etc., etc. But I think that the number one is full oil and gas embargo.
Thank you. Yeah, I could not agree more. Oleksandr, the floor is yours.
Very briefly, what I may propose, it should be the immediate reaction on the heavy crimes. For example, when we received the bombing of Mariupol, then we know that it costs at least 1 billion, for example, and this billion should be immediately arrested on Russia's bank accounts and transferred, for example, for as a reparation or restitution to Ukraine. So such a speed answer will just demonstrate, but the mechanism for such reaction should be established. And I agree with Tetiana that the financial sanctions should be immediate, strong and efficient. And I think that all possible, let's say, assets, Russian assets should be arrested until the full payment of for damages occurred will be, let's say, realized and fulfilled in whole amount. Thanks.
Thank you, Oleksandr. And one more question we received is as follows: what resources are still needed to document war crimes and atrocities committed in Ukraine? What is missing on the Ukrainian side? What can be done by the international community to help Ukraine document this properly? Tetiana, please.
We have spoken a lot about different international mechanisms, courts, etc., etc. But it is important to understand that majority of these gravest crimes committed in Ukraine will be investigated by Ukrainian law enforcement system, because none of the international courts have capacity to proceed and investigate thousands of crimes. At the moment, it's 6,000 of criminal proceedings registered, maybe more, but it's not the end, because we will have much more. I'm afraid even to think how much we will have if we have access to the territories like Mariupol, which are not now accessible by the Ukrainian side to investigate. So now we have problem on the domestic level to how to investigate all this amount of war crimes, which is domestic work for our law enforcement system. First is the absence of adequate legal framework for the proper legal qualification of the most serious crimes committed in Ukraine. We have no these types of crimes like the types of war crimes and crimes against humanity, only a blanket article 438 about the violations of the rule of the war, but we need the concrete types of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are not in our legislation. And the draft law that harmonizes Ukrainian criminal code with international humanitarian law, international criminal law, which was voted by the parliament in May last year, so more than 10 months ago, was not signed by the President Zelensky, and basically just lays in his office without any move. So investigators do not, prosecutors do not have adequate like articles to qualify everything what is happening in Ukraine. And also we will have a problem with the access to the territories in case of occupation, to crime the scenes, to involve specialists, forensic scientists, restorers in these investigations. We have problems with the capacity of investigators, prosecutors to investigate such a huge amount of war crimes and crimes against humanity. We have a problem with protection of witnesses on the national level, because currently Ukraine has no real programs for the protection of witnesses and victims. And also we will have a problem of real prosecution of the perpetrators in these cases when they are not on the territory of Ukraine or on the territory controlled by Ukraine, or they are in the territory of countries loyal to Russian Federation. And also I think we have to speak about the general national mechanism or infrastructure of justice in this for these most serious crimes which are committed in Ukraine, and also meaning that more coordination needs to be done between different like branches of our state authorities.
Yeah, coordination is one of the issues we thought about as a potentially problematic. So thank you for flagging this, and thank you for flagging some of the advocacy priorities that our advocacy team and the audience that listens to us can take into account and maybe help us work on. And I'd like to give probably a minute to Yevhen and a minute to Oleksandr to address this question, because we're really pressed on time and we still want to have a moment for all of you to have the last word on this topic. Yes, Yevhen, please.
Yeah, thank you. I try to be short. That our legislation have this blanket norm. It's not. It does not mean that we cannot bring them for responsibility by national legislation. It needs more methodological materials for our prosecutors, and it is great that we have it already with the support of international specialists, for example, from the French side. And what I want to add that we have a unique situation because we have prisoners of war, and part of them are committed war crimes, and they could be brought to responsibility on Ukrainian territory, and we not have obligation to repatriate them because they are not just just prisoners of war, but also war criminals, and our legislation make access us to physically remain them in custody, and then under national legislation brought to responsibility. So opposite to situation previous 8 years of war that we have in Crimea, in Donbas region, when unfortunately we do not have this physical access to the suspects. Now we have part of them. First of all, for the aviators who was catapulted and then captured by our law enforcement, and I hope that it will be a lot of people more captured by our armed forces, territorial defense, and it will be for thousands, not just 1 or 10 of people who appears before justice.
Thank you, Yevhen. Oleksandr, please.
Just briefly. Ukraine has almost enough financial sources for NGO society for support the work on the documentation registration. We have different proposals. I mean, not only our organization, but different organizations have sufficient proposals from donor society. But I will draw attention only to the fact that the millions of Ukrainians left Ukraine and they stayed outside of Ukraine in Poland, Germany, Spain, Italy, and so on. And some of them are the victims or the witnesses of the great crimes, war crimes, and In Poland, I know there is the process with the questionnaires of interviews of the person concerned, and we have to think how to combine these processes on national and international level, and not to lose the data received on outside of Ukraine. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Oleksandr. And before I turn it over to Jonathan in Washington, I'd like to thank our outstanding speakers. I think this was a very timely and very enlightening conversation, and I'd like to thank our audience and encourage you to stay in touch with us between our events and to follow the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine and our speakers on their respective platforms. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Olena, and thank you to our speakers as well. I think so important what you laid out in terms of both what you're seeing, what you're documenting, what the needs are, also the complexities of international law in this space, including with the Ukrainian government too, in terms of the ICC. And so I on one hand, we know that there are immediate needs to support the work that you're doing on all ends. And I think I understand that it's good to hear that there are resources that are available, but we urge partners and donors to put their resources in this space based on listening to you today. Not only will this is unfortunately things that you guys have not been able to document, how difficult it is to do this. And then when I think one of you mentioned, this is not the first time that Russia has acted in this manner, from Grozny to Syria to crimes in 2014, holding accountable right now. I think this is why I do believe President Biden has labeled this as such, is that there's a recognition that there is no end to this type of action with the current leadership in Russia. And so action needs to be taken. So we know that in this space, there's a lot more work to be done. And obviously the news, whether it's in Mariupol or elsewhere, is both horrific, heartbreaking. And part of our goal is to stand with you and the work that you're doing, and then also to make certain that our partners elsewhere, both in Europe and the United States, providing resources focusing on this issue. But please know, on the other end, we're pushing hard on issues from military assistance to the issue of sanctions, which you brought up. I take full stop that there's likely to be no magic or silver bullet of sanctions that can prevent what's taking place right now. But there is areas where it can absolutely be expanded and strengthened. And that's something that we will also be pushing hard on our end here to make certain that happens, but also in terms of support for other areas, from economic to reparations in the future. There's a recognition that needs to happen as well. And so I think we'll have this, we hope we can come back to all of you again, but also want to make sure that you know that you have a line to TTFU, to GMF, RPR, and our partners to provide support at this time. And we look forward to and appreciate all your comments, to following up with each one of you. And then for those that have joined today, you can please feel free to follow up with us if you have any additional questions or want to weigh in. And thank you again so much for those that have joined. And Oleksandr, I just obviously to hear the air raid siren behind you, I think you said a second or third of the day, is a recognition of the threats that you guys face. And also for civil society in particular in Ukraine, which is, has always been strong, brave in the face of a number of challenges, but it faces extraordinary challenges right now on top of all these other things that have been part of your work for years now. So we want to thank you again, all of you, for the work that you're doing. And we look forward to our next conversation. Oris, my colleague in Washington, D.C., thank you for your comments at the top, because I think helping others, it's something that Ukrainians understand fully well, others less so internationally, to understand the history of this is really important. So thank you, Oris, who's always advocating strongly for all these issues here in Washington. Olena, thank you as well. my colleague, and we look forward to our next TTFU conversation. But mostly, please let us know what we can do to be helpful to you and your colleagues in Ukraine, and we stand with Ukraine. Thank you. And everybody have a good rest of your day and happy holidays, the best that we can have under the circumstance. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
War has no holidays, sorry. Since the 21st, it was no holidays at all. And I thank you for your compassion and for your strong position for whole American persons and for USA, for support for Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Be safe.